Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Understanding Pain. I am your companion through this journey, Amy Davis, and I am a psychologist here at Montana Spine and Pain. And this is the second talk, which will wrap up the first section of how pain works and a lot of the neuroscience behind how we understand pain works, and then talk about coping and management. So hopefully you are in a comfortable seat with something pleasant like coffee or tea or something else to sip on. I'm here in my office. It's a lovely sunny day, and hoping that this finds you well. Normally, what we would do at the start of today is just kind of go around the room and check in with a word about how we're doing, how we're feeling in the moment, any questions that you had from last time. So in light of that, I'm curious if you did watch the first talk, if there are questions that still remain about the concepts, because the second talk today will really go over most of that material and review it so that we have a good solid grasp, and then talk about management. And we'll be talking more about DIMS and SIMS. So once again, I'm going to be sharing my screen with the lovely PowerPoint because there is some good visual information in today's topic. So let me bring that up. The joy of PowerPoint. All right. So let me get all of these bells and whistles. Okay. So again, talk 2 of understanding pain, coping and management. As always, we begin with a cartoon, Savage Chickens. Poor Death is sitting there on Freud's couch saying, "Nobody likes me." You know, it's interesting in that I think one of the hardest struggles with pain can be not just the experience of what it feels like, but that pain that persists, especially if it comes earlier in life than perhaps we were expecting. It can actually push up to the forefront some pretty direct reminders that we are mortal, at least in this body and in this incarnation, and that at some point we will weaken or sicken or become injured and have to face death. So I put that cartoon up there not because I think death is particularly funny, but because I think when we talk about emotional pain and the emotional component of working with pain, and in some cases suffering from pain, part of what we're talking about, I think, is that awareness of our eventual limitations in this particular body. So just briefly, I'm hoping that you watched the first talk because a lot of what I'm just going to jump into builds on that knowledge. We talked about pain, particularly persistent pain, as being a protective output of the brain rather than something perceived in the body, and then the brain picks up on it. It's the other way around. And when we talk about the false alarm of persistent pain, I am not saying in any way that pain is not real or that it is false. It is very real. Pain is always real. But there are many different reasons why the brain will overprotect with frequent pain alarms that are not about new tissue damage. That's what we mean by false alarms. So what are some of those things other than actual current tissue injury or damage that can cause the brain to overprotect with pain? There are a bunch of different things. Here are some. Chronic or excessive inflammation of the system. We'll talk about that. You know, the inflammatory response in the body, again, certainly it has its place in immune function and in tissue healing, but excessive or overinflammation can be quite painful. We'll also talk about inflammation in context of inflammatory diet or anti-inflammatory diet. So one of the things that, you know, the more we learn about the role of inflammation in the body and overinflammation in the body, the more we understand that that balance is really important. Persistent stress and stress-related muscle tension can also cause overprotection of pain. Absolutely. And it's kind of it's a bit of a vicious cycle, isn't it? Just in that if I'm in a tremendous amount of pain, I'm going to tense in response to that pain, or I'm going to be frustrated or distressed about that. Conversely, if my stress level is really high, I'm going to tighten up my muscles and guard in response to that, for sure. Deconditioning of muscles and the disuse of joints. It doesn't take very long for active human muscles to lose a lot of their strength and muscle mass, and that can increase pain. And then also the disuse of joints, and that can increase pain as well. And of course, we'll have a whole talk on physical reconditioning with pain, because moving the physical body is so important for health and well-being and function. Inadequate sleep or broken sleep. Again, good sleep is so important to mental health and physical health, that we have a talk about it. And it's one of the first things and one of the most frequent things that I ask people about is, how is your sleep? Again, this can be one of the things that is a cycle that is not going well for folks. If pain interrupts sleep, and then you're not sleeping very well, you're tired during the day, your energy's low, and then pain gets worse, right? Suppression of emotional pain or disavowing or pushing away emotional pain can also worsen physical pain. There's a lot of good research and clinical evidence that that's true. Conversion of emotional pain is a little more complex and a lot more rare. And that's something that, as a psychologist, that, we get a lot of training in, what happens if emotional pain or emotional trauma is severe enough that it is not able to be expressed or worked with directly under some of the pathways that we would think about. And instead, it can be converted into physical symptoms, not just pain, but physical symptoms, including some neurological symptoms or some sort of pseudo seizure-like symptoms. That can happen, although it's rare. It's pretty unusual for that to happen. But in some cases, if emotional pain is not being attended to, expressed, given space to kind of move and be processed, that can make physical pain much, much worse. And we'll talk a lot about that. Again, I'm not at Montana Spine and Pain as a psychologist because we assume that all physical pain is, you're not telling us about your emotional pain and suffering, or that somehow it's imaginary or in your head. However, the notion that our body and our mind and our spirit are all connected, it's not just a notion, it's a fact. And I know for myself that different emotions have very different physiological states, and vice versa. When I'm feeling physiologically well, that likely informs my mood. So we're not assuming that a conversion situation is happening. However, oftentimes physical pain can be alleviated by acknowledging, naming, and releasing emotional pain and talking with someone about that. And the key is to talk with that emotional pain with a caring, concerned other. And we'll talk more about that too. But that can be a piece of the story. Again, we're not saying any one of these is the cause. All of these can be a piece. We talked before about the neuroplastic changes in the way that the nervous system itself, so the brain, the spinal cord, the nerves in the spinal cord, process that sensory information. And neuroplasticity is both a helpful thing when we talk about retraining the brain to be less overprotective with pain, but it can also be an unhelpful thing when we're overlearning pain and when we begin associating, every time I move, it hurts, so I'm going to stop moving, right? So neuroplastic changes in just how the whole central nervous system processes that information and what can be perceived as painful or unpleasant. That is part of it too. And then a nocebo response. I would ask, if you're familiar with what a nocebo response is. more than likely you've heard about the placebo response. And I, for one, really, really like the placebo response. So I guess I would define that as we hear about this sometimes in medication or drug trials where a solution is something that's not expected to have a positive benefit, like plain saline or plain glucose. But the person's belief and expectation that this substance or this intervention will be helpful actually results in gains that are that are beneficial, and we call that the placebo response. I really like the placebo response because what I like about it is it's the mind, body, spirit kind of going somewhere interesting that we don't necessarily understand. Although I know in controlled research studies, we don't want the placebo response. We want whatever the active agent is to be much more effective than just the placebo response. I, for one, find the placebo response fascinating. The nocebo response is quite the opposite of that. And what that means is with something that we do that we expect to be really helpful, whether it's a medication, oral or topical medication, a good tissue massage, or something that's supposed to be pleasant, or an injection that we know is in the right spot and has, a good pain relieving anti-inflammatory medication in it. So we expect it to be helpful. And in fact, what someone's experience is that not only is it not helpful, it actually makes pain way, way worse. So having a nocebo response to something that's expected to be beneficial can also increase the likelihood that we will be overprotecting with pain and with distress. And if you're looking at a lot of these and wondering to yourself or thinking to yourself, I have a bunch of these, what then? What I would say to you again is that neurobehavioral rehabilitation from persistent pain is complicated, and there's not ever probably going to be one thing that we do or that you do that's going to be the magic wand. What there are going to be, though, are lots of things that work together, okay? So those are other things other than acute present tissue damage that can cause the brain to overprotect with more pain, okay? So this is a lovely drawing of some neuroanatomy in a nerve cell, and then an actual close-up image of what we are looking at. This is actually two neurons, and too small to see would be the synapse or the synaptic gap. And these are the tiny geniuses that make up the cells of our brain. And so the electrochemical messages that occur with the firing of the neuron down the axon to the nerve ending, whether or not it is strong enough to then cross the synaptic gap and so on to the next neuron. All of these neuronal connections make up everything that we do and understand of ourselves as human beings. My ability to speak to you, hopefully somewhat coherently, your ability to listen and to understand or to have questions, seeing, sensing, smelling, everything that I'm feeling in my body, emotions, creativity, all of those things. The electrochemical firing of the neurons make up all of those experiences. And also, neuroanatomy explains to the transmission of messages that we think of as pain. So neurotransmitters are chemicals that are transmitted electrically with an electrical impulse across the synapse, and that can affect those nerve pathways. So when we talked before in the first talk about rewiring the brain or creating new neuronal connections and all of the different things that can do that, we are actually talking down to the cellular level of our brain, and probably smaller than that. Many of the medications that are prescribed for mood are active at the synaptic level. So a good example of antidepressant medication would be serotonin-specific reuptake inhibitors. What the theory and the science behind those medicines for depression is that if a lived experience of clinical depression has to do with insufficient available serotonin in the brain, one of the ways that we might increase the amount of bioavailable serotonin so that it can be used appropriately and balance mood is that we might inhibit the reuptake from the synapse. So if one neuron is releasing serotonin into the synaptic gap, then hopefully what we are doing with that medication is we're inhibiting the serotonin from being taken up too quickly by the other receiving neuron, if you will. So therefore, if it's being left out in the synapse longer, more of the serotonin can fit into the receiving cells, be uptaken and be used appropriately. And what the experience will be is that mood will improve. Again, that's kind of a fast non-physician version of what we are trying to do with that particular medication. So a lot of the medications that are used are active at the neuronal level. So again, some of the tiny geniuses that make up our brains. This again is just an illustration of the synapse itself and how whatever is going to be released from the synaptic vesicle across that gap in the synapse, and the negative and positive polarization to release whatever's in the neurotransmitter through the synaptic cleft or the synapse to be received by the other side. So all of these impulses, of course, happening many, many, many times more quickly than it just took me to say that. For some of you, a review of some brief neuroanatomy, and for others of you, a look at the inside of your brains. Okay, so when we're talking about neuroplasticity, the structure and how the process of our nervous system work changes as a result of our lived experience. And that is absolutely true for all of the things that we do. Our growth and development as human animals in infancy, it depends on experiences, right? We are born with this wonderful brain and hopefully functioning sense organs and functioning motor control. But it's like, you know, a wonderful potential that is then activated through experiences, through motor control experiences. So through movement, with exposure with all of our senses. Obviously, exposure to other important people in our life is extremely important for how our nervous system regulates and learns about what it means to be relating to other people. So pretty much everything that we do as humans and as mammals, frankly, will change how our nervous system and our neurophysiology functions throughout the lifespan. And we used to think that once the brain is kind of fully hardwired and has had lots and lots of experiences, emotional development happening hopefully between, 12 and 20, something like that, the brain finishes fully myelinating, and we're thought to have a mature brain somewhere between 21, 22, something like that. So for those of you who have teenagers at home and you're wondering why in some ways they might seem, precocious or mature for their developmental age, but emotionally maybe not quite there, it's really because the brain is not considered to be matured until early 20s, something like that. We used to think that the brain stopped evolving and changing and learning and growing as an adult, and that was it. Whatever you had, you had. We know now that that's not true. Certainly, certain kinds of learning, acquisition of language, have certain windows that's going to be much easier. But the brain continues to be neuroplastic. We continue to learn based on experience. Right now, I'm having the experience of recording myself and having a tickle in my throat and having to drink water. By the way, speaking of my drinking water, if you're watching me, have you heard about mirror neurons? We learn from our own physical experience, but we also learn by watching others do that. And so as I was drinking water and having that experience, if you were watching me do that, it's likely, based on mirror neurons, that some of the same centers of the brain that lit up when I had the water lit up in yours as you watched me do that. We really do learn based on watching other people do that. Okay, so passive learning is a product of things that happen to us and whatever learning that we can acquire from that. Active learning is caused by self-directed experiences that we are intentionally doing. So we are intentionally practicing a foreign language in hopes that we'll be able to use it. We are intentionally learning Aikido. We are intentionally meditating, or we're learning how to knit, something like that. We're self-directing the experience, and our brain is changing in response to our learning. What our goal here with understanding pain is self-directed neuroplastic change that is designed to work with and interrupt that closed feedback loop of persistent pain and begin to downregulate it and work with that directly. We do that by self-directed experience. Okay, so when we look at how is it that pain becomes persistent and becomes that closed feedback loop that overprotects with false alarms. Again, false alarm not meaning that pain is not real, but meaning that those pain alarms are not connected to what's actually happening in the tissues. What we're talking about here is sensitization of the spinal nerves up and down the spinal cord, and a dysfunction of the endogenous analgesia system. So endogenous opioids, meaning the painkillers of the brain that we create ourselves internally. The only way that external or exogenous pain medication works is because it basically connects with receptor sites in the brain that are already there because we make endogenous painkillers or opioids ourselves. Those would be the endorphins and the enkephalins. So what can happen with this cortical reorganization here is that brain function changes as a result of pain itself. And unfortunately, it changes to be more efficient at producing more pain. So if we look at these two slides here, and it looks like what we've got is, a living brain, and one that was measured from somebody who does not report pain and somebody who is reporting pain. And what we're looking at here, what we're measuring is use. I'm suspecting probably glucose or oxygen or both. Okay. But if we look at some of the structures involved here, and this is the left side of the brain, it looks like, so the eyeballs would be here. This is the frontal lobe, our eyes are here, and then the brainstem would be here. So on this left side of the brain, in this brain that is being described as healthy, if we look at what's active, there is activity back here where some of the visual centers are, although the occipital lobe is here. There's activity here in the somatosensory cortex and also in what we would call the kind of the limbic brain, which has a lot of the information about memory, particularly memories of distressing experiences. So the amygdala and the hippocampus are interested again in all of those memories of threatening or possibly threatening events in order to help protect us. And then some frontal lobe activity, which we associate with so-called executive functioning. So sort of what teenagers developmentally have a hard time with. So perspective taking of somebody else's perspective and having empathy and using those mirror neurons to really be able to perspective take. Long-term consequential thinking, so being able to see and predict the outcome of certain decisions without trial and error learning. Long-term planning, complicated sequences of behavior, all of those things. And if we were able to see kind of the right side of the brain, you know, the right side of the brain and the left side of the brain do have a lot of overlap. We tend to associate the left side of the brain with more logical, linear processes, including language, and we associate the right side of the brain with more creativity, emotion, spirituality, sort of present focused sensations. There's obviously a lot of overlap and some redundant function, but we're also looking here at activity in the temporal lobe. So receiving language, being able to correctly interpret what the language is, and then output of language. So everything that's involved in this process, with me being here in this class with you, you being able to hear and comprehend and focus on all of this. If you think about it, it's an incredible amount of brain processes that are happening. This brain is a brain that seems like it's balanced and functioning and focusing on a lot of different things. This one less so. But if we look at where there's more activity, seems to be closer to the somatosensory cortex, or kind of this part of the brain, or the structures that are involved with not just knowing where you are in space, but knowing sort of internally what's happening inside the body, what the physical sensations are, and maybe what some of the strong emotions associated with are. You know, this is a brain that is able to function and attend to different things. If I kind of over interpret what I'm hearing from this brain, if this brain could talk, this is a brain that is focused primarily on the stimuli that seems to be persistent. And in this case, this is a person that has pain. So there are different levels of what we call neuromodulation, and the rewiring of, you know, if pain is about overprotection of the brain and the nerves running up and down the spinal cord and out to the periphery, then what that also means is that there are many, many different levels and places where pain messages, if you will, can be interrupted and modulated and hopefully downregulated. There are several different levels of that, which is what we're talking about with what the benefit can be, again, with medications, certain injections, physical therapy, and working overall on lowering the threat detection center by things such as stress management, sleep, eating, and movement primarily. So this just has an illustration of the first, second, and third order of nociceptors, nociceptive pathways, and how this works with nociception, which again, we don't have pain receptors. What we have are nociceptors, nociceptors indicating possible threat. And it's really an interpretive process of the brain based on context and past experience, but also based on strength of signal as to what the output will be of the brain, what the response will be from the brain. And this, of course, is somebody who decides, I'm going to stick my finger in a candle. Don't do that at home if you're thinking of doing that. This, again, is just an illustration, again, at the neuronal level, how the sensory receptors and the dorsal root ganglion and the dorsal horn are transmitting neuronal information that is responsible for our felt experience of pain. By the way, one of the neurotransmitters involved with pain, not making this up, is called substance P. I'm sure you've heard of other ones such as serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, but substance P is one of the neurotransmitters that is crossing the synaptic gap and responsible for our felt experience of pain. Okay. Some of this is review. We have nociceptors, which are danger sensors rather than pain receptors specifically. They react to potentially dangerous changes in pressure, temperature, and chemicals. But again, there has to be interpretation here. I have to have contextual information between, am I going outside when it's cold and snowing to put out the recycling and it's not actually threatening to me, versus I don't have a coat and I'm out longer term. So there's a contextual interpretation process of, okay, how threatening is this stimulation? Both responses are going to start out with the perception of it's cold, I'm going to have goosebumps, and there's going to be shivering, right? That's that protective response that my brain is having in response to that nociceptor, right? But I am the one that has the context and the information for, is this threatening or not? Okay, one of those situations not threatening to my tissues. One of those situations is potentially, right? So nociceptors, when activated, send information about the pressure, the temperature, or the chemical changes to the spinal cord via the nerve cells, which may or may not deliver the information to the brain. So whether or not the nociceptor messages even make it all the way up to the brain is about the neuromodulation of the spinal cord. If it does make it to the brain, you know, again, it has to be a process of the brain deciding, okay, first of all, what is the information that's coming in about the possible danger? Is it something that needs to be paid attention to? And what specifically is the information? And is it threatening or not? Part of the neuroplastic changes with pain, one of the ways that persistent pain can become that closed feedback loop that so often people find themselves in, is that those sensors of possible threat or danger, those nociceptors, become sensitized following injury. Again, the really good example here is the sunburn. If you get a mild to moderate sunburn, enough that your skin is red, and then you jump into hot water, you're going to feel a very much an increased sensitivity of those tissues because they become sensitized following an injury to protect them. But if the tissues have healed as well as they can in 6 to 8 weeks, okay, and nociceptors are still heavily sensitized, what happens is that it will take less and less stimuli to have that overprotective pain response. So the nociceptors themselves become sensitized following injury. Now again, in a pain system, if you will, that is working in an ideal way, the sensitivity ideally diminishes along with the healing of the damaged tissue. So once the sunburn has cooled down and healed and the skin has healed, the sensitivity and the pain should go away. In fact, usually sensitivity and pain go away before the tissues have finished healing. But there are other things that can keep the sensitization going longer, including things like excessive inflammation of the system and some of the other factors that we talked about. So the danger sensors themselves become more reactive to sensation, not necessarily pain, but possible threat. And the word possible here is really important. And again, I think many of these processes happen so quickly that most often they happen faster than our level of awareness or before we realize it. We might just have the experience of, I move and it hurts and I stop. But all of this can be what's going on. And, you know, within the human body as a whole, and with all of our senses, perception is not always completely accurate with what we are experiencing and what we're seeing. So this is a video called The Monkey Business Illusion, and we'll click on this link. It's a very short video, and the instruction is going to be listed very quickly. But this is called The Monkey Business Illusion, and I want you just to join me in watching this quick video.
The Monkey Business Illusion. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it, but did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events. And that's the monkey business illusion.
And if we were all here in person, I would ask how many people had seen that before and how many of you noticed the other changes other than what you were being asked to focus on, which was the number of times that the players in white were passing the ball. So what's the point? Well, part of the point is we don't necessarily perceive all of the different changes that are happening around us. What we perceive in part has to do with what we're focusing on. Also, in some cases, what we see, what we hear, what we taste, smell, and feel may or may not be a completely accurate representation of what's actually going on in the world or what's actually going on in our body. And all of what we perceive is top-down processing. So without our brains being involved, we would not be able to see or hear or taste or smell or feel anything, including pain. We would not be able to make sense of all of this information. And because the brain, the top-down processing is involved in this experience, much of what we experience can be inaccurate. In part, it has to do with what we're focusing on and what we're attending to, and we'll miss other things that we weren't attending to. In part, this has to do because of expectation effects and because of memory effects. Here's a question for you. How aware are you of what the route is to a place that you walk or drive to every single day? Are you really experiencing it and noticing all of the different pieces or nuances of it? Or do you have that experience when you go somewhere that you just kind of went there on automatic and you really don't remember what was happening, right? Versus if it's the first time that you're going somewhere where you really are trying to attend to much more stimuli. One of the expectation studies that was done in health psychology about what happens physiologically and emotionally to us when we have certain expectations about set and setting. And a lot of this research comes to us from addiction research and trying to figure out why in certain cases, people will experience overdose in different locations and all of that. And so one of this study was done on college students, because of course we like to do research with college students because they need college credit. And this study was set up to be about the social impact or social roles with young people in college. But the way it was set up is that The lab was set up to look like a lounge or a bar. And so again, kind of a random sample of college co-eds was recruited for the study. And what they were told was, you know, this is about social anxiety in relationships with college students. But it looked like a bar, and they were told that it was, you know, an open bar, and they could have as much or as little as they liked, and that they would be observed in this social setting. And so it looked like a bar. The non-alcoholic beer or drinks, I just gave the study away. The drinks that were served looked and smelled and seemed like, okay, that we're in a bar. And then the subjects were studied, and they were filmed to see what was happening with their motor behavior and with their speaking, and then progressively for that evening. And then they had different raters kind of rating the level of intoxicated behaviors observed, so that it was consistent. And yes, I already gave it away. But of course, what was actually being studied was how the set and setting and the expectation of past experiences that these college students had of drinking alcohol and how they would respond physically, emotionally, socially with alcohol on board. Could that be replicated without actually using alcohol? And lo and behold, the subjects were told that none of the drinks actually had alcohol in them. So what was happening? Were people fabricating the drunken or the slightly tipsy or slightly intoxicated behavior, or having a flush response and feeling maybe socially a little more adventurous because of the drinks? No, not at all. What was happening was those parts of the memory, the somatosensory cortex, and all of the memory centers that had had previous experience of, oh yeah, if I have a couple of beers or a couple of drinks, this is usually how I feel, and this is usually how I act. That was replicated physiologically because of the set and setting, but because of the expectation effect. So in many cases, much of what we experience is informed by past experience, past memories, okay? So that's one interesting study, and they've replicated it a number of different times. Also, brain processes can create and do create experiences, including very, kind of colorful, explosive experiences of sights and sounds and smells and tastes and physical sensations, including pain, without any external sensory input at all. For those of us that remember our dreams and have really vivid dreams, we are going through this process every night. All of those experiences feel and seem and sound, and in some cases, very much are experienced as they're real, even though we're dreaming. And hopefully it's a pleasant dream, but in some cases, if it's, more of a nightmare type dream, those experiences can be very, very realistic, and our body is reacting to them as though they are. But all that sensory input is contained within our brain. The other time this happens is if there are hallucinations, whether that is part of a mental health condition or whether that's a response in some cases to medication or other metabolic things like fevers. People are experiencing sights and sounds or objects that seem very real as my voice is to you. But all of those stimuli are being generated internally to us, not externally. So our brains are capable of giving us experiences that are real for us, but that are generated internally and that are top-down processes. And again, much of what we experience in the world when we go to different places or interact with different people is about our memories of those previous experiences and our expectations of what happens. Now, this is a wonderful, wonderful study, and it's so interesting. And I love that people had to wear this. Gosh, it looks uncomfortable. It wasn't actually that heavy. This is an older study. This is 1991, and this is called the sham head stimulator. Head stimulator. That sounds fun. So what the subjects of the study were told is that, you know, they were going to put this lovely apparatus on their head, and what was going to happen was that electric currents were going to be passed undetectably through their brains, and then the reaction time on a learning task was going to be measured to see if this undetectable electric current would change their reaction time at all. What they were told, and this is very specific because every person was told exactly the same thing, they were told that they would not feel the electricity at all, but that it might give them a headache. Notice the word might. Just the suggestion of, yeah, you might have a headache, okay? So these wonderful, lovely headgear setups were connected to wires that looked like they were connected to a very large control panel with a dial, a big, large, prominent dial that was calibrated from 0 to 100. It was not connected to the dial in any way, of course. And what the participants were told was just report and rate the intensity of any headache pain you might experience, and we'll be measuring your reaction time. Okay, so what happened with this study, and this has been replicated many times in many different countries, and I think Lorimer Moseley mentions it in at least one of his talks. 50% of the participants reported headache pain. Not surprisingly, the intensity of the pain that they reported was directly related to how high that dial was turned up. So again, remember the prompt was, you might have a headache, but they can see, right? So there's credible evidence of possible threat, to go back to the language used by Lorimer Moseley and David Butler in the protectometer. The brain is attending to, carefully, searching for credible evidence of possible threat. So you're wearing electrodes, you're told that electricity is going to go through your brain, and you're told you might have a headache, and you can see this dial, and you can see, oh, it's up to 10, or it's cranked up to 90. So credible evidence of possible threat resulting in headache pain. Pretty interesting stuff. So one of the other prominent theories of pain was the gate control theory. And I would like to bring out some information so that I make sure that this is really, really accurate. And I'm pulling this out of page 22 of the big blue book, How Pain Works. And so Melzack and Wall's theory was published in an article in about 1965. And all that we want you to know about this was that what they are suggesting is that the brain and the spinal cord in particular contain a series of gates, not actual literal gates, but a series of gates which, when they're opened, allow the sensory information to travel up to the brain. And if they're closed, then the sensory information is blocked either completely or partly, and as a result does not travel up to the brain. So if that sensory information is not able to be transmitted successfully to the brain, the theory goes, then we'll be less likely to experience pain. And the pain gates were located in the dorsal horn area of your spinal cord. Okay, so what we talked about is that there were different things that would be described as gate openers or gate closers with this gate control theory. So this research was one of the first kind of mainstream scientific studies about how certain social factors or psychological factors are considered pain openers versus pain closers. So for example, focusing on pain and the negative experiences mood-wise of pain, like irritability and anger and anxiety about the pain, tend to be gate openers that are going to increase pain. Other states or factors such as relaxation, being distracted, positive mood states, physical activity, those tend to be gate closers. Obviously, it's not necessarily that simple, but this was one of the first biopsychosocial stances and articles and perspectives on there's so much context and experience going on in the present with whether or not the nociceptive impulses are going all the way up to the brain, being interpreted by the brain and the dorsal horn in the brain as, uh-oh, yep, this is threatening, and going down. So partly when I think about this theory, I think, well, there's hopefulness here. If there really are ways to kind of interrupt or close those gates, so to speak, then that's a whole lot of what we ought to be focusing on. It's an older theory now, and it's not necessarily what everybody focuses on now, but it's an important theory for sure. So here again, if we have the open pain gate where the nociceptive impulses are moving up to the brain and then being interpreted as pain, what we're seeing then is that we have a nociceptive response, which again is possible threat. We're not sure what it is. Is it damage? Is it temperature? Is it pressure? Substance P is not blocked, and substance P is one of the neurotransmitters responsible for our felt experience of pain. Goes all the way up to the nerves and is interpreted here, and then goes from there, okay? If the pain gate is closed though, the nociceptive response, we have released our own endogenous opioids or endorphins. Substance P is blocked and is not transmitted up to the centers of the brain that will then overprotect with a pain response. Again, this is an oversimplification of a very complicated theory, and I would draw your attention in the book to page 22 and 23 for more discussion of the gate control theory, but also our endogenous pain modulation system. It's pretty amazing stuff. So this is a review, not just of the concepts in this talk number 2, but also in the first section of how pain works. And again, this is a rough overview of a lot of pretty wonderful information in that book, and also in the Explain Pain Supercharged book. So overall, pain is an alarm system that thank goodness we have evolved with, because it's there to protect us from possible threat or possible danger in the body. The brain activates this system in response to the perception of danger. And a lot of what we've talked about with DIMS and SIMS is that that can be danger inside of me, inside of the body, or inside of my mind and my perception, or outside of me. And this alarm system is there and responsive. Very frequently with persistent pain, however, the amount of pain that we receive is often not in direct proportion to the amount of tissue damage. And we talked about the phantom limb pain and also the asymptomatic images last time, but then we also talked about, you know, if we do have tissue damage, often with our endogenous opioids, there may be no pain initially, or it may take a while before then all of a sudden, oh, yep, I'm having pain. When pain persists, the nervous system and that overprotective alarm system becomes more sensitized through all the different things we've been talking about, through neuromodulation, neuroplasticity, stronger, faster communication, creating more and more and more false alarms. It does not mean that pain is false. It means that the pain alarms become less and less connected to what is currently happening in the tissues. So the experience of pain then that we're having may or may not be related to the input from the nociceptors that we talked about. So initially, if it was related to input from nociceptors, eventually persistent pain can become that closed feedback loop that is self-perpetuating, okay? So over time, we think that the nociceptors may have less and less to do with our pain experience. and that the sensitivity of the central nervous system, the brain, the spinal cord, the nerves, has more and more to do with maintaining that over responsive protective output of pain. In other words, pain does not necessarily equal danger or harm to the tissues in the present. There are pain gates, metaphorically, literally, but metaphorically, in the spinal cord that either can block and stop or allow and enhance pain experiences. And the gates are located at every junction between the nerve cells involved in processing that sensory information. So the good news there is that there's many different ways and levels of interrupting and modulating and downregulating that sensory information. What we can do intentionally is to engage in activities that will in fact activate the mind-body relaxation response and our natural endogenous opioids, and allow pain messages to begin to downregulate. We do that with physical activity. We do that with neurophysiological quieting activities like mindfulness meditation, relaxation response breathing, progressive muscle relaxation. We do that by attending to a positive mental state and also allowing space and processing for whatever emotion or mental state is coming up. And we also do that by pleasurable activities, doing things that we greatly enjoy, focusing on the SIMS rather than focusing exclusively on the DIMS. Which brings us to our action planning with SIMS. So at the end of the first talk, I invited everyone to come up with at least 2 SIMS that were things that you hear or see or smell or taste or touch. And this would be that time where we would go around the room and hear about those. And if you didn't do that activity, I encourage you to do that now and think about at least a couple of things that you hear that make you peaceful, happy, joyful, reassured that things are going well. So things that you hear, see, smell, taste, and touch are what we did last time. For next time, couple of things. Things that you do, so activities that you do that you're willing to share or discuss with others and whoever it is that you're doing this program with that are SIMS for you. So, again, I think about time hiking in the woods or even just sitting in the woods. I think about pulling weeds in the garden, walking the dog, right? Those are all things that I do that are wonderfully enhancing for me and enjoyable. And hopefully I get to do those regularly. So think about the things that you do that are SIMS that you're able to do right now, or things that you remember doing and would like to be doing again. This is also the point where we check in with functional goals. Last time we talked about a functional goal being something physical you do with your muscles. And if it's helpful for you to kind of track what your goal is and see how you're doing with the goal. Did you achieve the goal and did it work for you? Was it, a challenging enough goal to be motivating, but not so challenging that you kind of threw up your hands and didn't do it? So in page 227, you have a functional goal planner and a tracker. And again, as I think I mentioned before, if it's helpful and useful for you to track your own progress and see it in that way, great. If it becomes stressful or burdensome and you don't quite see what the point is, please don't do that. It's as useful for you as you want it to be. Okay, and that is the end of our second section here. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you next time.